Hi guys, I'm Talisa with Talisa Aquarist, and today I wanted to go over some tips that I would love to give to beginners who are just setting up a fish tank. I really want to help you guys just set yourselves up for success with your first fish tank. And one of the ways that you can really set yourself up for success, believe it or not, is the size of fish tank you start out with. I would recommend you start out with a minimum of 20 gallons of water for your tank. It can be a 20-gallon long, 20-gallon high, whichever you prefer. That doesn't really matter. The bigger the better. You know, if you're comfortable with setting up a 29-gallon tank or a 40-gallon tank, go for it. But I do understand why that would be a little intimidating because, you know, maybe you've never kept a fish tank before and you're like, 40 gallons seems like a lot of water. It's really not, but, you know, start out with a 20-gallon at least, right? If you start out with a bigger tank, the parameters of your tank will maintain themselves much better. Think of it this way. Let's think of a little mud puddle and you run through it and you slosh up all the mud in it. Well, immediately that little body of water, the pH, the parameters of the entire puddle have been completely changed. It's automatically out of balance. Now think of a lake. You have a huge body of water. You have people out there boating on it, jet skis. You have people swimming in it. You have little kids ruffling up all the sand on the edge and just making it a muddy mess. And you have thousands of fish living in this lake. And yet the lake just continues to cycle itself and maintain itself. That kind of is the same thing with, let's say you have a little 2.5-gallon fish tank that you could start out with. Or you have a 40-gallon tank. The 40-gallon tank is going to be so much easier for you to maintain. You're going to be much more successful with keeping fish alive in a 40-gallon tank than you are in a 10-gallon tank or 2.5-gallon tank. So start with as big of a tank as you're comfortable with, preferably a 20-gallon. And once you get that, I would also say do a dirted planted tank. Because you're really setting yourself up for success when you do that. You don't have to know how it works to set it up and have it work for you. You can learn all that after you set it up. You know, there's so much that I've learned after I've set up a dirted tank. I learned a little bit. I learned how to set it up. That's basically it. I learned how to set up a dirted tank and I just went for it. I messed up a few times, but it was okay. You know, nature really knows how to correct itself and improve and just balance itself out. So set yourself up for success by getting a big tank and go buy some aqua soil. Now you can use potting soil or you can just use dirt from your yard for a dirted tank. However, because you're a beginner, I would highly recommend going with aqua soil. It is the most expensive substrate you could start out with. However, I'm thinking long-term success. You know, it's going to be a bit more money to get a bigger tank and buy more substrate and buy aqua soil, but you're setting this tank up to last for years. You know, you could have this tank 20 years down the road and it's still going to be thriving and vibrant if you set it up as a tank that is a full ecosystem. So I would get the tank, I would add a layer of aqua soil, about 1 inch, and then I would put 2 inches of sand on top of that, and then I would just go buy whatever plants I wanted to and I would plant it very heavily, and I wouldn't overstock the tank. Because you're a beginner, one thing I would recommend is set up the tank and don't add any fish to it. Don't add mystery snails either because they'll uproot your new plants. Make sure your plants are all rooted in for a month or two before you add mystery snails. So don't add any mystery snails and don't add any fish to it. I would add some shrimp, neocardina shrimp, because they're hardier than the cardina shrimp. So go get yourself some neocardina shrimp, like 5 shrimp, 10 shrimp, whatever you want to do, and put those in the tank. And get some little pest snails, because pest snails really help create a complete ecosystem. You can get nearite snails if you want, but start with pest snails, which will probably come in on your plants. So you probably don't have to go get those. You know, just put your plants in the water and the tank and you'll probably find little snails hatching all over your tank. Do that and add some shrimp and just let it sit for a month or two. You don't need to do any water changes on it. You don't need to have a filter on it. None of that. Just set it up, put those stuff in it, and just watch it. And you would think that it's not going to be very entertaining because you don't have fish to watch, but watching shrimp and snails is quite entertaining, to me anyway. I love seeing the little tiny lives just all over in the tank. It's fascinating. And once you have your 20-gallon tank all set up and it's been like running for about a month or two, then you can go start adding fish. I wouldn't add more than 5 fish at a time. Let's say you want Corydoras, I would add 4 to 5 of those only. You want a betta fish, I would just add 1 betta fish and just let it live with the shrimp and snails and not add any more fish for a month or two, and then maybe add a school of neon tetras. Those are fish that are going to be good for a beginner. They're pretty easy, especially if they're in a 20-gallon tank. You shouldn't have to worry about anything. They should all get along well. Neon tetras live for years. They're a very hardy fish, and they're not going to be breeding like crazy where you end up with the tank is overloaded, right? So I would recommend starting with that. Now let's say you're like, I don't want to do a dirted tank, but I still want a planted tank. Is that possible? Yes, it is. It's just going to look a little different. So if you don't want to do a dirted tank, that's totally fine. I understand. Still start out with a 20-gallon tank and go get some sand and do like 2 to 3 inches of sand. You really, in order to have like a really thriving planted tank, or just a thriving tank in general, you need a thick layer of substrate. So go get 3 inches, put 3 inches of sand in the bottom of the tank, and don't plant it. Add plants, but not plants that root down. So I would do Anubias, I would do Java fern, and guppy grass, and let me think, and Boost philandra. Those are all plants that do not need to be put into the sand. In fact, don't put them in the sand. They don't need to be put in the sand to thrive. And they pull nutrients from the water column instead of from the sand. And once you've bought your guppy grass and Boost philandra and Anubias and Java fern, and moss. Moss is another one you can buy. I would glue those to rocks and to driftwood and just scape it like that. And I would just let it wait for a year. And once the sand is kind of discolored, there's mold on top that's been sifting through, you know there's lots of nutrients in that sand, then I would go get pearlweed and rotala and swords and crypts, whatever types of plants that catches your fancy that you would love to see in your tank. Add those into the substrate. And the substrate should now have enough nutrients to keep those plants alive. If you put them in when you first start the tank, the sand is going to starve that plant of nutrients, and the plant, it may not die, but it's going to melt back, and it's going to take 6 months to a year for that plant to really start growing, for you to see much growth in it. So that's why I recommend just adding plants that just pull their nutrients directly from the water column, because the sand is sterile when you add it to the tank. Now let's say you add the sand, you don't want to do a dirted tank, you put the sand in, and you want to add your plants immediately that need to root down into the soil. You can get root tabs, and you can add some fertilizer to the water. I don't recommend doing fertilizer to the water because I don't use filters for my tanks, and I don't use filters as well. Or I don't use filters and I don't do water changes, sorry. So I would not add fertilizers. That's the reason I recommend doing a dirted tank, is because you don't need any fertilizers. The plants have all the nutrients in the tank that they need, and when you don't do water changes, the plants that pull the nutrients out of the water to grow, well, they have all the nutrients they need as well, because you don't have a filter pulling that out. You're not doing water changes to pull those nutrients out. Now, when you first set up a tank, there can be excess nutrients in the water, and you may need to do a few water changes when you first set it up. But if you do what I recommended, where you don't add any fish for a month or two, and you just have shrimp and snails in there cleaning stuff up, keeping the plants clean, you shouldn't need to do any water changes ever on the tank. The shrimp and the snails are pretty hardy, and they're not going to overload the tank in a bad way. And if the soil is capped off with 2 inches of sand, you shouldn't be having excess ammonia or nitrates in your water. Alrighty, so just a little recap for what I was just telling you guys. I would go get a 20-gallon tank. I would put 1 inch of aqua soil in it, and then I would cap that off with 2 inches of sand, and then I would plant it very heavily, and I would add shrimp and snails. And then I would just let it set for about a month or 2. Don't forget to add water conditioner to the tank as well. Some beginners don't realize the importance of water conditioner. Water conditioner just, let me think of the right word. It doesn't remove chlorine, but it just removes the effect that chlorine would have on the fish. Chlorine can harm fish. So add water conditioner to the tank, and after 1 to 2 months, you can then begin adding more fish. And I would recommend not having more than 10 fish in your tank. That does not include shrimp or snails. Keep as many shrimp and snails as you want in the tank. But if you're gonna have a 20-gallon tank, I would recommend not having more than 10 fish in there. Now, maybe after a few years, the plants are really robust, and let's say your nitrates just keep coming out at 0, then I would add some more fish, but probably no more than like 5 more fish. Add another school of fish or something like that. And one more thing to keep in mind that I have not mentioned yet in the video is lighting. Make sure you get yourself a light that is going to grow plants well. Now, it doesn't need to be a $400 light or anything like that. You can get a $60 light, $100 light from Petco, PetSmart. I use Aqueon that I get. You can find them at PetSmart or Petco. But I am going to look into different lighting. Now, they've done a good job. I've used them for years for growing plants. But I want to look into other lighting as well. I haven't explored all the options for lighting and haven't found what works great or what doesn't work. So just get yourself a light. If it says that it grows plants well and it fits your tank, I would go with that. Make sure it's not too bright or too dim. When you add your tank, if you can just see into the tank well, it's probably not too dim. Now, if it's like so bright that you're like, whoa, when you look at the tank, that's probably a little too bright, and it probably won't be very good for your plants. Also, don't keep the light on for more than 10 hours a day. I keep my lights on for 8 to 10 hours a day. Some days it's 8, some days it's 10. I typically, as a general rule of thumb, I try to turn them on at 11 a.m. and turn them off at 9 p.m. If you go to bed later, around midnight or something, and you want to enjoy your fish tanks until then, just don't turn them on until 2 in the afternoon or 4 in the afternoon, and so you can enjoy them until later into the evening. And just one last tip to really help set you up for success before you set up your first fish tank is go subscribe to Father Fish on YouTube. He really breaks things down and simplifies things much better than I do. And he has so much more information than what I have. So if you go subscribe to him, just go look at his videos that he's put out. He says for beginners, in the video, on the title. Go subscribe to him, go watch those, and he'll be able to explain just the cycle of your tank and how the ecosystem all works together and how to create a live food web in your tank so you're not feeding your fish every day, and really just simplify. This is your first fish tank, and I really want it to just be like a simple and good experience for you. You shouldn't have to be like scrubbing the tank and doing water changes every week and wondering why your fish are dying and all that. All that being said, I would also like to tell you what not to do for your first fish tank. If you do these things, your first fish tank might be a flop. I'm not saying it will be, but it might be. These are mistakes I've made. I started out, I got a 2.5 gallon tank for a betta fish. I did my research, or so I thought, and I went and got a 2.5 gallon tank and added some gravel to it and added some plastic plants and some fake hides in there. No organic materials whatsoever, like no rocks or driftwood or anything. Plopped them in the tank and went and got a betta fish. Now, I did let the tank cycle for a few days, which was good of me, but I didn't add a filter, I didn't add a heater, and I just put the betta fish in there. And as you can imagine, the betta fish did not live for very long. I think he lived for 6 months, which is, I'm shocked he even made it 6 months. I feel bad for that poor fish. So that was what I did with my first fish tank. I don't recommend you do any of that. do your research. And I thought that I was a great fish keeper because I was not keeping my betta fish in a 1-gallon bowl. Turns out you can't just plunk a fish in a body of water and expect it to survive. There's so many things that go into it. I would not use gravel in your tank. I wouldn't just go get a tank and dump some colorful gravel in there and some plastic plants. I would do the aqua soil, the sand, live plants, you know, really set yourself up for success. I would also not start out with a small fish tank. And you see a small fish tank behind me. I'm not against small fish tanks. You're probably wondering, well, Talisa, why can't I just go get a 5.5-gallon tank that's, you know, right behind me and just go set up a planted tank for one betta fish? You know, one betta fish seems so much easier than a 20-gallon or a 40-gallon. I promise you it's not. It's not easier. My smaller tanks are harder for me to maintain than my larger tanks. I have this smaller tank because there's a very old betta in there that doesn't swim much, and so he's more comfortable in a smaller tank. So yes, I do have smaller tanks for the comfort of my betta fish. If I didn't have betta fish, I would possibly keep smaller tanks just for growing shrimp in. You know, I guess if you wanted to start with a small tank, you know, maybe just throw some shrimp in there. I don't recommend starting with a small tank, but you can. You know, this is just tips that I have for you that would help you have the most success possible, right? You know, don't take me too seriously. If you really want a small tank, go get a small tank, put some plants in there, you know, set it up as a complete ecosystem, like a dirted tank, and just add shrimp. You know, and once the shrimp are thriving and the plants are thriving, you can add a betta fish with heavier fins, because betta fish with heavier fins do better in smaller tanks. Misconception about betta fish. I know this is for fish tanks, but just a misconception about betta fish. A lot of people think the smaller the fish, the smaller the tank. That could not be farther from the truth. That goes for tetras and betta fish, you know, fish that are smaller. If a betta fish has really short fins and is small, it's going to do a lot more swimming because its fins aren't holding it down. Tetras, they're small, they're very active, they zoom around. Keep them in a big tank, like no smaller than 10 to 20 gallon. 20 gallon preferably. Keep them in a large tank. Now the betta fish that just look big because they have so many fins and they're just, you know, they look big, right? Keep them in a smaller tank, because they could become stressed if they're in a very large tank, because their fins just pull them down to the bottom. And if they have plants to lay on at the surface, it's okay, you can keep them in a bigger tank. But my old betta, he's laying up here in the plants and he just lays around. He's pretty old. So yeah, start with a bigger tank if at all possible. I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, please subscribe. I post fish-related content multiple times a week. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to drop them down below. Or you can reach me on Instagram or Facebook. You can just direct message me on there. It's under Talisa Aquarist with the same logo, so it should be pretty easy to find me. And thank you guys for watching.